Thank you very much. And if any of you have sat through, since they have me doing 4 talks, if this is the 3rd or 4th one, you're pleased to, you can leave because you'll get tired of hearing me. This actually is one of my favorite topics of things. And I'll start right off and say there is nothing new about this. J.H.B. Roy, who was a famous British researcher back about 80 years ago, did all of this. I've just put some of it to pictures, so I'm not, you know, I didn't steal his work. I redid some of it and put it to pictures, but the classical stuff has been done, and done here. The whole thing that I like to studying animal growth is something that intrigues me. It's not something too many people, I expect too many of you to get excited about. But this picture to me is a classical way to show you that as the calf goes from a calf to a heifer to a cow, not all of her body parts grow at the same rate. She just doesn't start off as this calf and just expand out to the cow. Like any other growing animal, different parts grow at different rates. Her legs appear to get shorter as she gets old. Her head appears to get smaller as she gets old. Well, it does as a percent of her entire body mass. This is the easy one to see. The difficult one to see is the internal growth, because different parts of her body will grow at different rates. In the last session, I was talking about how the mammary gland grows at different rates. It grows from anywhere from, you know, the same rate to maybe 400 times as fast. It's amazing how, you know, it just changes at different time points. Maybe my 400 is a little high, but it can grow amazingly fast. But what I'm talking about here is what's happening to the rumen, what's behind that hair coat that we can't see. And this is the way the rumen of a calf starts off, of a stillborn calf. You've got the rumen reticulum on the left that is, at birth, it's sterile. It's very thin. It's about the thickness of 2 or 3 sheets of tissue paper. No papillae development at all. It's a smooth surface. You've got the omasum, which is an intriguing organ that I won't get into, but it's a really interesting thing. And then the abomasum, where colostrum is going to form a curd. That's where colostrum does its thing. It's where if you're basically any of your milk or milk replacer has its initial form of digestion is going to take in the abomasum. In the last workshop, we were talking about curd forming versus non-curd forming milk replacers, which is different from one side of the pond to the other. Ours don't curd and yours generally do, and that curd would form in the abomasum. And then by 12 weeks of age, we want it to look like this. So in a 3-month time period when we don't change the body weight of that heifer all that much, we don't change a lot of things about the heifer, but we do want to have a completely different rumen in that calf. Now I'm going to zip through this one quick. I mean, the true stomach starts off about 60% of the capacity of the forestomachs. The rumen maybe 25%, but there isn't much of anything there in terms of tissue to do digestion. By 3 to 4 months, the rumen gets up to 65%. And by the time she's a 10-month-old and thereon, adult rumen, 80% of her capacity. So a real change in that. But for the dairy farmer, this is the animal that we can comfortably and economically feed. The other ones are going to cost me more money. So the idea of promoting rumen development and getting this animal to this age is really what we want. And get her out to this, the ruminant phase. And they're not all 95-point cows like that. That's actually a 97-point cow. But so to look at some of the changes in the physiology of this rumen over time, I've had several students do PhD works with rumen development. And so I can stop for a second and just tell you, if you like any of these pictures or want them, or want to take them and use them for something if you're in industry, they're out there for free on my website. And if you just Google dairy cattle nutrition somewhere in the top page, anywhere you'll find Penn State Extension dairy pages, and dairy nutrition is where they are. But you got to be careful when you get in there, because there's about 20 to 30,000 pages of stuff in there, and I don't keep track of all that's in there. But get into well, I do keep track of it, but how much of it is, but get in under the calf section, and there's a whole section on rumen pictures, and it has a lot of these. But this is what the rumen looks like on about a 4-week-old calf, where you have a little bit of papillae development. But what I want to focus on are these papillae, which are classically termed finger-like projections that grow out of that smooth wall of the rumen. And I think this picture, hopefully you can see that they are lined with capillaries, and there's just a couple cells of epithelial tissue over those capillaries. So the ability for the end products of microbial digestion, primarily VFAs, to get absorbed there is really, it's quick. It happens. And to me, this is the intriguing part of a dairy cow that isn't there at birth. This, to me, is the organ of a dairy cow that allows her to do what she does. She can produce, the high-producing cows around the world can produce their body weight in milk fat, which is a real high-quality fat. They can produce their body weight in milk protein, which is a real high protein, and they can do it every year. I mean, there aren't too many other species. In fact, I can't think of any that can do that every year. A chicken can do it really faster than a cow, but she can only do it once. The cow can do it year after year. So they're an amazing part of that animal. And when it comes to growing the heifer, they're an integral part of getting that heifer growing at a fast rate, or at the rate that we want her to. The next set of pictures are some that come out of some research we did with it. At 3 to 4 day increments, we took pictures. Well, we had to kill a calf each time to do it, or more. But to just show you the development, this is what a calf's rumen would look like at birth, or this was probably 1 day of age in a calf. To the naked eye, it looks completely smooth. This is under a microscope, and yes, you can see this. And what you end up with here, from a histology basis, is you've got this tissue layer here, which is sloughed off really quick. I've got connective tissue underneath. I've got submucosa, and they're all going to change. The interesting thing, though, is that cells. It's a very rapidly growing tissue, and cells go from here to here in 5 days. And then they get sloughed off. So they're rapidly growing cells, constantly moving out there, and so the development happens real fast. And what we did with this study was we force-fed these calves, so they were getting probably 500 grams of starch a day. And when I'm talking about development of the calf and grain feeding and all this, what I'm really talking about is starch. The requirement for rumen development isn't calf starter, it's the starch component of it. And I was just talking at lunch of all the things we list on feed tags, we list a lot of garbage on there in the U.S., like crude fiber, which doesn't mean anything to anyone anymore. But for a calf starter, what I really ought to have is starch level. It probably will never happen. But as I go to, this is about a 4 day increment after they've had starch. And I should back off and say by probably 1 day of age, I've got a lot of bacteria. The rumen is born, when the animal's born, the rumen's sterile. Within hours, it's populated. And usually with bacteria, and a whole variety of bacteria, usually more lactobacillus type bacteria that make acid really quick. But I won't get protozoa in there. For those of you who studied ruminant nutrition, you've got like 85% of the bugs in there are bacteria, and 15% are protozoa. The only way they get inoculated with protozoa is animal contact, because those protozoa are actually a live animal. So as long as we have them individual, they won't have protozoa, they'll just have bacteria, but they still get good development. This would be about 8 days of age. I've gone in sequence here. and they're pointed. As they keep on growing, they get longer. This would be about 12 to 15 days of age. They become rounded, and the older they get, the more rounded they are. And if you ever want a trivia piece of information, and someone asks you the difference between a sheep papillae, which looks like this, and a dairy papillae, which looks like this, they're rounded. That's supposed to be a joke, okay? But it's true. But, you know, they look slightly different. Now, this picture is a nice one to show you part of calf management that we don't always see. Here's a piece of that cell, some of these cells being sloughed off. A whole part of rumen development is these cells are moving out very quickly. They have to get sloughed off. And if we get a completely non-abrasive diet in that calf, we can have lots of issues where these cells don't get sloughed off. We need something to take that off, something with some abrasiveness to it. And I'll come back to that, I'm pretty sure, in a little bit here. And this is what they look like by 21 to 28 days of age. It's better to be conservative and say 28 days of age, because at that point in time, it's easy under a microscope to see where the epithelial tissue now is, where the capillaries are, because those capillaries have grown out. And it's just really intriguing. And all this happens really fast. But with the 28 days, that's 28 days with starch in the diet. So I've been getting bacterial growth and I've been getting VFA production. So 4-week-old milk calf looks like this. 4-week-old calf on milk and grain looks like this, just completely different. These VFAs that are produced in the rumen, the major VFA sources in there are going to be acetic, propionic, and butyric. We've got a few other minor ones in there, but those are the main ones. The bacteria, even in the calf that digest fiber, their major end product is acetic acid. It's a 2-carbon compound. The bacteria that digest starch, different species of bacteria, and their major end products are propionic acid and butyric acid. So it's the bacteria population that's shifted, but it's because of diet. So for simplicity, I say it's diet, but I know really it is the bacteria that is the end result that's changed. Now, acetic acid, which is 2-carbon, and propionic, which is 3-carbon, get absorbed across those papillae. They go to the liver, and they get made into sugar, glucose. The liver gets pretty well adapted to that the first few weeks of life. For any of you that studied a bunch of physiology, I mean that calf starts out being able to utilize glucose, and it's going to use lactic. It's going to use sugars basically to make its energy. In a short period of time, the liver changes over and starts using acetic and propionic acid to make energy. So there's a shift in the metabolism of the animal that's really related to rumen development, but not directly. Well, it is directly, but it's a different thing that we're talking about. But the other part of starch digestion is butyric acid. So I get propionic about 85%, about 15% butyric acid. And butyric acid happens to be a 4-carbon compound, and it does not get absorbed across the rumen wall. The interesting part about calf physiology is at a very young age, and I don't think anyone's determined that it's anything different than 1 day of age, the rumen epithelial tissue is able to take butyric acid and convert it to glucose. And it's a real interesting thing. It happens the whole way through the life of that animal. A dry cow, there's been research showing the same thing. They've got this little different set of metabolism that butyric acid gets left in the rumen wall, converted to energy. And then the interesting thing is that the rumen doesn't have to compete with the rest of the animal. Now, what I mean by that is when that calf makes acetic and propionic acid, which also get converted into energy, it goes back in the bloodstream, circulates throughout the animal, and the easy way for me to describe it is every cell in that animal is trying to get that glucose because every cell is trying to grow. The rumen might get its fair share, and if I put a calf on a diet that never gets propionic and butyric acid, it will get rumen development out by 6 months of age. I mean, it is going to develop. But it's just that if wherever they have a situation where they're making butyric acid, they don't have to compete with the rest of the animal to get that energy. So the rapidity of rumen development with butyric acid is amazing. It just goes so fast. And you know, that's actually the chemistry that's been really well worked out. We know a whole lot about that with the calf. The other interesting thing is the pH of that. It's part of getting the bacteria established in that calf so that we do get the bacteria growth and the breakdown of starch is related to pH. Bacteria don't grow in neutral pH. They want a little bit acidic. But it is very typical in that young calf. This is some data where we put rumen cannulas in calves at about 2 days of age, and then we can study their pH. And you've got, you know, this is going from 1 to 6 weeks of age. And we have rumen pHs in there of 5. We have rumen in pHs of 4.5, and that's very typical for a young calf. And for those of you that look at rumen pH of cows or think about that, I mean, if you give me a cow with a rumen pH of 4, I've got a seriously sick cow. That's really low acid in there, but that's typically what happens with a calf. And the thing about this is you start getting some VFA production in that calf, but you don't have the absorptive mechanism to pull that in. But then you get down here to 6 weeks of age when they're eating a lot of grain, they're producing a lot of VFAs in there, so they easily drive that acid down and get some pretty low pHs. And I don't really worry about that with rumen development because that low pH in the calf allows an environment that encourages the bacteria to grow, and that's all part of the system. Just to, you know, the four stomachs of the calf, this is where milk is digested in the abomasum, the small part. Acetic and propionic are going to be produced in the rumen, and butyric and propionic, primarily propionic with a little butyric, is produced with grain in the rumen. And it encourages papillae development in the rumen. I'm not going to get into this today, but there's some good research that has shown in the last 5 to 10 years that some of that butyric acid also spills down into the small intestine and does the same thing. So starch feeding to develop the rumen is also helping develop the small intestine. Both of them are villus related, and as you grow the villus in the small intestine and the rumen, you're going to encourage more absorption of nutrients. So they're both good. So rumen development's accomplished by grain feeding on a practical basis, and it's starch feeding. You do need to be careful. Once in a while, you'll come into some grains that are very low starch. I know some in Pennsylvania is sold, and I've analyzed it, that's like 4 to 6% starch. I mean, that's not a good calf starter. I want something that has 30, 40% starch. In a perfect world, at least 30. But the papillae development is has a continuum in it. This is just some slides that I took bunches of years ago now of just looking at papillae development on calves that are on milk and hay. Now, I would get the same thing if I had just milk only. But I start off with at 4 weeks of age, there's not much there. 8 weeks is a little bit more, 12 weeks is a little bit more. And if I followed that out to 6 months, they would have a normal papillae. But it's not getting the capillary development like I have here. The dark color in this is actually a bit of of an artifact of when we slaughter the calves, the blood is still left in those capillaries that are in the papillae, and they make it look darker. That's where the dark color comes in. The other ones just have papillae growing without those internal capillaries. But 4 weeks and 12 weeks of age, completely different animal. And that's the part where the coat on the outside of that calf is really limiting people seeing what's going on inside. The inside is very different. If I look at these calves may be just as big or bigger than these calves, but the development of them is completely different. So I like this picture just because it gives you that comparison of milk only, milk and hay, milk and grain. Just to point out that this calf here is going to be completely different, and these are at 6 weeks of age. That the microbial protein that she's producing, because the bacteria are growing, they make bacterial protein, which she's going to live on most of her life. It's high in protein percentage. It's also high in biological value. And what the term biological value means, it's amino acid composition relative to the amino acid requirement. And the amino acid requirement primarily of that young calf is muscle. That young calf is growing muscle at a very rapid rate, and that's the main thing she's growing. We know the amino acid composition of muscle, and you can look these up in a table, and the amino acid composition of rumen microbial protein. And whether you call it luck or evolution, they're the same. They're really, really similar. And you know, the calf has developed a system where it produces what it needs. It's actually slightly better than milk in terms of amino acid composition for growth. But then along with that come the VFAs. And VFAs are what gives us, you know, the milk production that we get from our high-producing cows. It's a result of VFAs. They're really an end product, a byproduct of this. Whoops. They become within just a couple of weeks of time when the liver of that animal converts over to utilizing these VFAs to make glucose. They really are a very efficient form of making glucose, and that calf really grows. The bottom line, when we get that calf with a well-developed rumen, we wean it, and they should be growing at a faster rate than they were before weaning. Just because of the energy and protein quality and quantity that they can produce. So it's all butyric acid. It takes 21 to 28 days. And one of the management thing I will tell people is I want a calf weaned when it's eating a kilo. If you'll get me up to 2 kilos, I'm happier, of grain a day. But the issue also is it needed at least a half a kilo for 2 to 3 to 4 weeks beforehand. The normal range is 21 to 28 days. And management-wise, where people get in trouble is they're on a feeding system where the calves aren't eating very much grain at all until the week before weaning, when they cut dry matter intake way back. And yes, at weaning day, they eat a kilo or a kilo and a half or 2 kilos of grain. But they didn't have it long enough to have rumen development. They started rumen development, but they haven't got it completely finished enough. I mean, there's no perfect when it's finished, but they don't have it far enough along to allow that calf to be weaned and not lose weight. Now, if you were in my talk the last time I showed this one, but this is a classical piece of research comparing 2 different levels of feeding, or 2 different types of feeding. It's a little confounded, but I've got the blue line here were calves that were on a 20% protein, 20% fat milk replacer. I think that's what it was. A study done in Israel in this case. The orange ones were Holstein calves that were allowed to suckle their dams ad libitum. So you got high quantity and high quality. High milk on a ad lib basis for a Holstein ought to be at least 30% fat and 30% protein. They were offered free choice starter and water, and they weaned them at 6 weeks, which is quite typical. And to ask you the question, do you want the calf that was, as a dairy farmer, do you want the calf that was on the blue diet or the orange diet? I'll let you think about that. While you're thinking of it, I'll give you what I would like to have for my veal calf. I lived in Italy a couple times, and my wife and I like veal. Can't buy it in the U.S. because it's not something Americans like at all, so I have to raise a veal calf. My veal calf right now is 3.5 months old, and I'm very proud to say he is eating 7 pounds of milk replacer a day. And doing quite well, and I hope to get him up to 8 by the time when I go back home. My goal is another month, I want him in the freezer. I want him to grow as fast as possible. Now that's the hint. Do you want the calf on the right or the calf on the left? If my goal is to raise a heifer that's going to calve at 22 or 23 months, I want the one on the left. Because when they show you the rest of the data, now you got some weaning response here of these calves didn't know how to do anything other than drink milk, so they lose weight the first week. But following that, they don't gain. Their average daily gain isn't good, and you look overall, and this happens study after study after study, that their average daily gain is lower than the calves that were on the red, or that were on the blue diet, and it's primarily because of rumen development. They simply weren't eating grain, or if they were, it was just at the very end, and they didn't have the digestive capacity in the rumen or the liver function, which is part of it. The liver hadn't converted over to making energy from VFAs, and so they can't handle it, and they can't grow as fast, and at the end of some period of time, this one went to 12 weeks, sometimes take it out to 20, the calf on a low rate of gain did better. And I spent less money on her, too. So it helps her, and it helps your pocket. This is just a study from 2013. I won't get into it. It shows the same thing. They were both Journal of Dairy Science papers, but Alex Back did this one. Feed them higher levels of milk. They eat less grain. It's a real standard thing, and they don't grow as fast up early on. And this, again, goes back to some British data from 1971 that was classically done. They took calves at 8% of dry matter of milk replacer all the way up to 20%, which fits in very well with some of our current feeding systems, although 8%, most anyone would argue, is just a little low by today's standards. But you get up to 20%, and that's pretty much ad libitum. We have some computerized calf feeding systems that put them up to ad lib, and that's about it. And you see this direct relationship to grain intake versus milk intake. And it's real classical. Grain intake, or the satiety in the calf, is limited by dry matter and fat intake. It's a combination of the two. So in theory, if we fed more milk replacer and had real low fat, we might get the grain, and we can play around with that some, but it's more theory than practicality. Part of the follow-up, though, is if this is just a review that this guy did showing grain intake before weaning and its effect on grain intake after weaning. And this gets back to what the dairy farmer wants to do. You want a heifer that's going to grow fast enough to calve at 23 months of age. I want her eating grain at a rapid rate the whole way along, and that grain intake is going at weaning is going to impact for the next several months what that animal's going to do, which is the primary reason why I want rumen development, because and there's also a direct relationship to grain intake, energy intake, and growth rate. So the rumen development story is that's kind of putting all the pictures in there, and hopefully not too much of the physiology to bore you. But that's how it gets from point A to point B. And there's more than one way to do it. The interesting, I always ask grad students the question, is grass a calf starter? And the answer is yes, if it's got sugar in it. Your springtime grass that's got lots of sugars in it is as good a calf starter as calf starter. It may not be as concentrated. You got a lot more water in there than a calf starter has. But the sugar in calf starter is going to drive butyric acid production and cause rumen development. These are jerseys in Central America where they don't feed grain. And those jerseys get reasonably good rumen development, albeit not as quick as what I want you to have in your systems, but they do get rumen development from that grass. Now, in terms of the rumen development, in terms of the next end is, do you feed forage or not? And the system with that in terms of for rumen development is when I'm looking at rumen size, when I feed forage, I will increase the rumen size over a non-forage. But that's primarily because the forage sits in the rumen longer. The digestibility of forage is far slower, especially when the rumen isn't functioning well, than concentrate. So that's more of a gut fill thing. In terms of papillae development, as I've already said, the concentrate does a much better job than forage in terms of that. Passage rate, concentrates go through the rumen faster. There's definitely a case where forages go through the rumen slower. It's one of the reasons why I don't like your systems where you're feeding grain and straw, or I'll use my better term of bedding, to young calves. Because I got a rumen that's about this big, and I put anything in that rumen, whether it's grain or whether it's forage or whether it's straw, there's only two ways to get that out of the rumen. And we know from research that the average particle size of everything leaving the rumen of a calf is about 1 millimeter or less. So that's really, really tiny. And there's only two ways to get it out of the rumen, just like with a cow. She can digest it with the bacteria, or she can chew her cud and break it down physically. The calf has got a small rumen, doesn't have super digestive capacity, so it's probably going to be a little slower, especially in the fiber part of digestibility. So as I feed her undigestible feed, like straw, what I feed her today stays in the rumen tomorrow and the next day. Hopefully by the fourth day she's chewed it enough to get it out, but she's also replaced more. And that's filling up space in the rumen. Physically, she has a limitation as to how much she can eat. When I feed her concentrate that is highly digestible, much of it that she eats today is out of the rumen tomorrow, and she has room to put more in tomorrow. So my rate of intake, of dry matter intake, is always going to be greater on a concentrate versus a heavy forage diet. And the poorer the digestibility of the forage, the slower it's going to be, the more she has to rely on chewing. So the end result on that is my forage is going to give me more acetic acid because of the bacteria that make it. That's fine. Propionic acid is going to be more on the concentrate diet, and butyric acid is more. Well, propionic acid and acetic acid all go to energy, so I want lots of that, and butyric acid goes to energy in the rumen, and I want a lot of that. And that is one that's a major difference here. On a high forage diet, there's very low levels of butyrate. On a high concentrate, there's high levels of butyrate. And so the pH here can be variable. Usually the pH on a calf diet with high forage is much higher. They don't have that pH of 4 in the rumen like I showed you before. And rumen health, plus or minus, depending on how it's handled, and with forage, you'll probably always have better rumen health. So when you've got that young calf on starter, do you feed it forage or not? And my academic answer for you anymore is it depends, because it depends on what kind of a starter that calf is on. If it's a very high starch starter, and for example, pelleted in a very fine pellet, the particle size of that is real small, and you don't have any abrasiveness for scratching off those cells in the rumen. So that pelleted, fine pelleted starter, the answer is yes, you need some forage in that calf starter diet. If you've got a calf starter that has fiber in it, effective fiber for a calf is 4 millimeters or more, or actually might be a little bit less, 3 millimeters probably, but if I have whole oats or ground crushed oats or something, or barley, something that has particle size to it, then the answer is no, I don't need forage because I've already got effective fiber in there. So the particle size of that diet, you need something that gives you the straw effect or the scratching effect, but it can be oat hulls to do the same thing. So textured starters or pelleted starters, they both work and both are very effective, but the answer of whether you feed forage or not depends on what you're doing there. Now, factors affecting weaning age, and I tried to put a few other things in here but the health definitely affects weaning age. Sometimes tradition. I don't like that as the answer, that we've always done it that way. That's why we're doing it now. Palatability of the grain. The big thing is calves need to be taught. And that's one of the little key tricks that I always tell a dairy farmer is innately a calf knows how to suckle and a calf knows how to nibble what's on the ground. So if you don't want to teach that calf that the stuff that you just put in that bucket in front of them is something that's good for them and they're supposed to eat it, then dump your calf starter on the ground, use it for bedding. And they will get some better intakes of calf starter right away. And that was also supposed to be a joke, but you didn't, okay. Now, usually I say jokes don't translate, but we're speaking in the same language here. Come on. But calves, well, I mean, they innately nibble what's on the ground, which is why when we give them some bedding, straw, they nibble some, and that doesn't bother me. In fact, usually that's why I say don't feed any forage to calves, because I know you're probably going to try to keep some decent, clean bedding in your calves, and they are going to nibble it. It's innately, they know that's what they want to do. So I got a couple things here. Average age at weaning, I'm always encouraging people to wean a little bit younger. And for the dairy producers in the audience, what's the most expensive dairy replacement animal on your farm per animal per day? I'm going from birth to 23 months of age. What's the most expensive animal? It's a pre-weaned dairy calf. I don't care what kind of a diet you've got on. In terms of labor and feed, she is the most expensive. What's the least expensive animal you have, dairy replacement per animal per day? And the answer is a first group after weaning, because they're fed an easy diet, low labor, cheaper diet, and they're small body weight. So the decision to go from the most expensive to the cheapest is your management decision. We're about 30%. This is actually old data now. I'm hoping it's a little better than that. But 30% of our producers wean at 8 weeks and 20-some% at 6 weeks. The closer you get down to 6 weeks, the more economical it is. My summary, and I think I'm just about out of time. All right. You need to balance liquid feeds and solid feeds. We know that the calf needs some milk to get her off to a good start, but if she gets too much, the start doesn't continue. And we want to make sure that we have milk level that are going to get us to getting good grain intake. I generally say no more than 5 to 6 liters of milk a day. Someone was talking in the last session about maybe concentrating that a bit more, and I won't get into that, but we don't want high levels because I want to encourage high levels of grain. If I lose a few grams per day average daily gain the first month of life, I can easily make that up in the animal once she has a well-developed rumen, and I can do it cheaper. Don't want to wean the calf until they're up to 1 to 1.5, and one's on the low side of grain per day. And then once that calf gets up to 2 kilos of grain a day, she has to have forage. I mean, you can start forage earlier on than that, and I don't worry about it. But don't be one of those people that leaves them on out to 4 months of age before they get forage. And I've seen that way too many times. That calf has a developed rumen by the time she's eating 2 to 3 kilos a day. She's producing a lot of acid, and I don't want acidosis in there. So I think I'll stop and go for a couple questions.